Mm-hmm.
Zero smoker, you mentioned that people use other kinds of treatment options. So do you know if you could put that in as a
control?
Because the zeros might be medicating themselves in other ways.
Yes, so we have a number of other measures there. First of all, we have self-reports of whether they smoke tunga, or mutunga, which is this indigenous plant. We have self-reports on whether they use traditional treatments for worms, and in early analyses of the numbers before I had them all, that was significant. I don't know if it still is. And we also have marijuana use self-report. Now marijuana, we don't have as solid evidence that it's effective against parasites. However, it seems to be effective against plant parasitic nematodes. So marijuana plants seem to be extraordinarily resistant to root nematodes. So that suggests that maybe THC or something else in marijuana is a nematicide. So we have the marijuana self-reports. We also have blood samples. You can't get THC out of saliva, but you can get it out of blood. So we're hoping to get some money to do those assays and look at THC in blood. And if we can figure out what is in tunga or motunga, we also have those blood samples. Maybe we can find that stuff in there too.
Does cannabis grow locally? Or?
Yeah, they grow locally, and it's why almost everybody smokes that too. And I forgot to mention here, if it wasn't obvious, all of these controls have no effect. So we get the negative relationship between cotinine and in this study and worms, even after controlling for age, wealth, acculturation, traditional healer status, and camp leader status. And none of those controls were significant, nor did they improve the fit of the model. Yeah.
Fascinating hypothesis and a different way of looking at an addiction, but this explains why you might self-medicate with tobacco. But does it explain the extreme addictive potential of tobacco?
Yeah, I don't know. It basically shows why tobacco might be, why it might trigger a reward circuitry. Why we might have evolved to be rewarded by psychoactive compounds. And so then it kind of depends if you believe that the story for addiction to tobacco is pretty similar to the story for addiction to any other drug, alcohol, is pretty similar to the story for addiction to anything that people like food or thrill seeking or whatever, then it would. Because then what we have is just something that people like, and you're susceptible to addiction to any of those things and overusing them. And maybe in that case, the story of addiction becomes more a story of what's available in your environment. And so once tobacco becomes cheap and available, that's what enables you to become addicted to it. Does that make any sense what I'm saying? And we can be, basically it seems a lot of people would argue we can become addicted to anything that people like, sex, food, drugs, thrills, what have you, and that it's the same story in each case. If that's true, then yes. If that's not true, then I'm not sure if it does or not.
Yeah, some things are harder to stop when you don't want to do them.
Right, and so, I mean, the idea that if you actually look at the negative, and we asked them a lot, we have a lot of data on, and they recognize that there are these negative health consequences of smoking. They don't put it in terms of cancers or heart disease, but they say, yeah, it makes me cough. So some of the men said, yeah, I did stop smoking because of these negative health consequences. So they are weighing the pluses and benefits. And when we ask them about the benefits of smoking, they say it gives me more energy, more strength, it makes me feel warm, I can work harder, things like that. So in their minds, they are weighing costs and benefits of smoking. Maybe a second, slightly different answer to your story is if you're going to self-medicate as prophylaxis, you have to do it all the time. And so that might be an alternative way of getting at the addiction story, that people are going to habitually use this stuff because whenever you have it, you should take it to prevent infection. Yeah?
I'm just going to ask a little more about the psychological model that's underpinning this. It sounds like people get this psychoactive buzz and then trigger this addictive behavior to treat pathogens. It sounds like a prediction that you might make is that the extent of the psychoactive buzz that you get should predict the extent of addiction that you see across different kinds of drugs.
I'm sure they looked at that. I don't know that I know the data on that. there's like a ton of animal models of this where they can actually measure neural responses to these drugs, and then also the degree to which the drug reinforces consumption, and then how long it takes for that effect to extinguish. And I just don't know those data, but I bet they exist. But I don't have them on hand. Dan?
So two things. One, just a suggestion. You mentioned betel nut. Given that's another substance, the consumption of which is highly gendered in some societies, you could conceivably have the flip in that women would be your target, because at least in Indonesia, in many traditional Indonesian villages, men smoke and women chew betel nut.
That's a good idea.
The production is entirely indigenous, so you don't have the same confounds of questions of market access and current wealth.
That's a good idea.
The other thing that I thought of was you mentioned the animal models. It seems to me that there's nothing specific about human beings in your hypothesis.
That's right.
So while I realize you're an anthropologist and you're working, in this in some ways ideal and other ways challenging field site, perhaps collaborators of yours could run experiments with animal models that we can't do with humans for ethical reasons. We can't infect people or manipulate their nicotine use, but you can certainly do that with rats.
Yes, so we have a rat guy that does drug addiction on campus in the psych department, and he has agreed to do exactly that if I am willing to do the IRB. He will run the study. And I probably will take him up on that. And then we can do the flip side. Instead of, we can now infect the rats and look at increases in, let's say, a lace diet. Now that study has been done with a malaria parasite and a particular toxic diet that was effective against malaria. Now, it wasn't necessarily ecologically valid because it wasn't clear if that toxin that was in the rat's diet was anything the rat would naturally come across or anything like that, nor was it clear to me from the paper whether rats get infected with malaria in the wild or not. In that study, they found that the rats that ate more of the toxic diet were protected from infection, but they didn't alter their consumption, they didn't increase their consumption of the toxic diet upon infection. And there's been a number of these kinds of studies, and I would say roughly half of them show a chemoprophylaxis effect, where the animals that eat more toxin are protected, but they don't shift their diet. And the other half of them, which mostly look at insects, but in some cases vertebrates, find that the animal does shift. So it's a very mixed set of results. But we would like to do that study with rats and nicotine and helmets.
Yeah. Exactly. And you can, put them in a counseling program after.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just have a really brief suggestion for control. What about wearing shoes? Whether they have shoes? Because aren't a lot of these worms
Yeah, that's a great one. That's a great one. Very good. Thank you very
It
much.
should covariate with your wealth.
Probably we should have asked about shoes. They all have, in fact, one of the gifts was flip-flops, and they almost all wear flip-flops. And so we gave them, as one of the gifts, they could either get the bowl or a pair of flip-flops, a new pair. But they almost all have flip-flops. But that's good. Yeah, Rob.
A couple questions. So I'm trying to get my head around the evolutionary story here.
Okay.
But first, it seems to me that kids ought to be more vulnerable to worms in terms of fitness costs than adults. And yet, what I know about psychoactive substance use around the world is kids never do it, or hardly ever do it. And so it seems to me your model predicts kids ought to preferentially smoke and then quit as they get older. And so that's, do you want to answer that one? And I've
Sure.
got a longer question.
There's been huge numbers. This is why it's great to study nicotine, because any question you have, you can go get the answer. And there's been a huge number of studies of the effect of nicotine on rats at all stages of development, from conception through adulthood, and you find a very pronounced negative effect of nicotine on rat development, brain development in particular. So I think the story would be that kids are avoiding these neurotoxins because it's going to be extraordinarily costly in terms of interfering with neural development.
And that's brought, because there are others, so when we told our son that he couldn't have coffee as a teenager, and our son, he went to the literature and dug up a bunch of papers showing that coffee had no effect whatsoever on teenage development. So
Well, I did that when my wife was pregnant because she kept wanting to drink coffee. So I did, and I found the same thing. That there wasn't any evidence of a negative impact of coffee.
So you have to
There's a
say that
huge-
nicotine and caffeine, it's just on average, it's good not to.
not to have something that, because basically,
Yeah.
and the main story is that the receptors that are used for neural receptors, for example, including the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, play a key and very different role in development. They basically modulate all of the signals that are guiding development. And so if you interfere with a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor during development, you interfere with all of the signaling that's going on that is organizing that development, that is in tissues that are not neural tissues.
Okay, second question is sort of a just general question, which is, so most of these plants are pretty localized plants, right? I mean, so cod and tobacco. And, I mean, and
Coca.
coca, kava, I mean, so that means that however this works, it can't be specific to particular compounds. It has to be, it's good to get high.
And that's what I think it is. It's
Okay.
psychoactivity is the cue.
Okay, so that means you have to that the animals have to learn how to do this, right? That they've got to take this stuff, and so what I don't understand is, so here we have, people here, none of them have helmets hardly, and they're smoking like crazy. I mean, in some place like a French restaurant or a German restaurant, everybody's smoking like crazy. None of them have helmets. So that suggests this is not very well regulated, right? That you want to
Plus
get
it's
high.
chemoprophylaxis.
Well, but then why does it go down in your experiment? So it seems to me you can't
Well,
have
that's
both.
the chemotherapy. So yes, you're right.
So
I see
you've
what
got
you're
a problem in.
Yes, you're right. So one predicts increase, one predicts decrease. So the way I would sort of split that is just like with the tobacco plant. You have a base level that's at a lower level of constitutive defense of nicotine.
Mm.
Then you increase it when you get infected, and you decrease back down to that base level, but not down to zero.
And you explain the high levels of smoking in places like Western Europe by the fact we're so rich.
I think part of it, yes, is the easy, readily available. But if you actually look at the
Got to be much
percentages,
higher than most of these. The rate at which Eastern Europeans and people like that consume tobacco must be higher than the rate at which these people who are helmet infected consume tobacco. Yes.
probably the rate of smokers. But if you look at the prevalence of smoking,
Yeah,
Then I'm not
25
sure.
or 30%, I think, is the typical kind of.
yeah, and here it's closer to 100%.
You had almost no women. I mean,
Okay, so almost 50% then.
yeah.
But what you're talking about is 30% men. So if you look in the
No,
U.S.
30% people, I think, is a typical. No, 30% of the population is smoking, roughly. It's the numbers for these. Well, we have an expert.
Where's the expert?
Mark, tell us.
Yeah, in Eastern Europe, certainly, it's gonna be over 50%.
Yeah.
In Western Europe, you have this, the gender pattern was very strongly established till around 1980. And just after men's smoking starts to fall, women's smoking starts to rise. So the US is basically ahead of everybody else on the curve. We're now down to
25.
20, 22 or
20
something
something,
adults. But I think Europe is twice that.
How does the nicotine content of cigarettes consumed in the West compare with what these guys are smoking? Because it could be that you're smoking a lot, but you're not getting that much nicotine. I don't know.
Well, we have the cotinine values, which gives us kind of an index, and we can see that the distribution of cotinine values in these guys is pretty similar to what, in fact, and there's a little bit, I can show you those data because I have the,
It turns out that the nicotine consumed is damn near invariant to the nicotine content of the cigarette.
It'll just smoke more if there's a
They
little.
smoke more and they smoke differently.
and you can see that on these charts. These are the heavy, regular cigarettes versus light cigarettes, and you can see the dotted line and the solid line are almost the same.
If you have a filtered cigarette, there's a way of holding it that blocks the filter. It turns out people without knowing it learn to do that. So that's what gave the low nicotine cigarettes such a bad name. It turned out not to actually influence the level of those toxins at all. It like, it looks like smokers are very good at self-regulating nicotine levels. But actually, what's complicated about this hypothesis, given what we know about actual smoking behavior, is it's pretty clear in Western studies, I don't know about traditional studies, that smokers are very good at regulating nicotine intake for psychoactivity.
Right.
And so smokers, there's a way of puffing a cigarette that generates energy, and there's a way that generates relaxation. And without particularly knowing it, people, when they're trying to do work, and when they're trying to relax, it doesn't sound like they're treating worms.
I agree that nothing about it. We looked for any hint in our population that people were smoking to treat worms, and there's no, or any medical problem. And they say they're doing it for energy or strength or be warm, which might be similar to relaxation.
So the energy stuff seems to be real.
Does it? Is there evidence on that?
The problem is, again, for IRB reasons, you can't generate
Manipulate,
nicotine, people don't use it, so it's possible.
Well, you can give people nicotine. You can't give them cigarettes, but you can give them nicotine, small doses of nicotine. I think that's considered pretty safe. So I've seen a lot of experimental studies when it comes to nicotine, like with a patch or something, or an injection.
I don't know, the studies I know from some time ago, they couldn't really get rid of the confound of whether people got more energy when they smoked because they were relieving their withdrawal, or
Right.
whether the chemicals actually helping.
Right.
Caffeine's got the same problem.
Question?
Yeah, is there any evidence that medicines in the Western world that are used to treat parasites or have more often have psychoactive properties?
I don't know of any evidence like that. So as far as I know, levamisole or bendazole, I've taken a bendazole, I haven't, you can't even tell you've taken it.
It is actually, well, I know only through my own clinical errors that it's psychoactive that if you overdose people with it. I
A
think it's-
bendazole?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
They get real jittery and they act kind of.
I mean, a lot of these things do attack neural systems, so it wouldn't be too surprising if in, the peripheral nervous system, at least, there were some effects, because they are clearly attack, not all of them do. Some of them attack other aspects of the parasite, but many of them are attacking the nervous system of the parasite. Yeah.
Any epidemiological data in Western populations, say young adult populations, that show less likelihood of getting a cold, lower rates of infection?
Well, it's only gonna work, at least, like, it shouldn't, I'm not thinking it's gonna work with viruses or bacteria. I think it's only gonna work with parasites that have nervous systems, like. So I agree, an epidemiological study of, say, smoking versus worm, you might be able to get country level data on, but those studies are hard, because you have so many compounds. But yes, I think that would be an area to look at, say, because there's a lot of very good data on the epidemiology of worms, and there's a lot of good data on the epidemiology of smoking behavior, so you might be able to do country level or even region level analyses, if that's what you were thinking.
More of people who do versus don't within a common environment.
And I wonder if those data would be available or not. Some of these studies, big health studies, ask all those kinds of variables. So there might be a data set out there that had worm data and all kinds of other health data, including, tobacco addiction is very commonly included on these health surveys. So it's not inconceivable that there are some data like that I could exploit to maybe test this.
Your hypothesis is that alcohol would kill some worms, or?
Right, so what's going on with alcohol? I ignored it, and it's good that you brought it up, because it's not a plant toxin. And the question is whether it's just another psychoactive drug, in which case it just falls right into this story or not, depending on whether the story is true, or if there's something special going on with alcohol. There does seem to be selection on alcohol metabolism genes in certain populations. So it's not inconceivable that the story for alcohol might differ. Now, one of the stories about alcohol metabolism genes is exactly a parasite story, that alcohol is metabolized to acetaldehyde first. And it turns out acetaldehyde that's what I'm pretty sure gives you the hangover. It's extremely toxic. It's very damaging to your liver. And interestingly, in Asia, they have two mutations in metabolic enzymes. The first one increases the metabolism of alcohol to acetaldehyde, and the second one decreases the metabolism of acetaldehyde. So the net effect is to increase the concentrations of acetaldehyde. And people have been debating why, and it looks like there's been a lot of studies of those genes. It looks like there's selection on those genes because those mutations are at very high frequency in those populations. And a story that was put out there and was never followed up is that acetaldehyde might be effective against Entamoeba histolytica. It's chemically very similar to the standard treatment for that pathogen, and which is prevalent in Asia where these mutations are found. So this idea was put out 20, 30 years ago that maybe the selection was on increasing that toxin from alcohol to treat pathogens, but I haven't seen anybody follow up on that. So I don't know what the status of that hypothesis is.
Look, alcohol is much easier. If the water supply isn't reliable,
That's, I think, yeah.
you know, if the water tasted bad for a week and we had to make do with gin.
Right. So I think that's a very strong hypothesis that it's a water purification thing, and we've evolved to either like it or tolerate it for that reason. So I do think that's a strong hypothesis.
Alcohol is brand new, right? There's no alcohol until you have farming in any.
So the idea would be, kind of a John Hawkes, Henry Harpending kind of story that. Well,
Okay. Fine.
I don't know. I'm not an expert in this area, but
Yeah.
it looks like there's been strong recent selection on. I mean, those alleles are at high frequencies in Asia, and it looks like strong recent selection on.
Well, why do you need farming for alcohol? Any fruit will produce alcohol.
Probably not.
Hunter-gatherers don't have, the only thing that you can, honey is usually where hunter-gatherers get alcohol
And nectar, you can do it from
and nectar, but it's not,
It's tiny.
not very available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would have to be some story like lactase persistence kind of story. A very, very strong selection in recent selection since.
Well, but I mean,
agriculture.
but then the psychoactive effects are just accidental side effects, because that's not just one
According to
gene.
this story, yes.
Yeah.
Couldn't you have it as the cue to the presence of lots of sugar? So like if you smell alcohol.
Well, that's another
that's a-
standard
that's a-
story
that's a
that
cue that
alcohol, it
there's
tells you that there's
lots of
ripe
ripe fruit.
fruit. And that story is controversial also, that whether you could actually detect those levels of alcohol, and
That could be more ancient.
that could be more ancient. So that's, I think the guy's name is Dudley that was put that one forward, and it's been critiqued in the literature, so.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to end it there, so